On the 27th of June 1944, American B-17s took off from their airfield in England to attack targets in northern France. The mission was a so-called milk run. The Allies enjoyed air superiority over Normandy. This was a routine, low-risk operation. But hitching a ride aboard one of the B-17s was a most unusual passenger, Brigadier General Arthur W. Vanneman, a man who was privy to the greatest Allied secret of the war. Vanneman should not have been on that bomber. There was no German fighter opposition, but the mission ran into heavy anti-aircraft fire. The plane in which Vanneman was flying was hit by flak. As the pilot fought with the controls, he ordered the crew to bail out. Down into German hands with his vital secret, parachuted Brigadier General Vanneman. The man who had given Vanneman the go-ahead to fly was General James H. Doolittle, one of the greatest heroes of American aviation. By allowing Vanneman on the raid, Doolittle had placed the lives of thousands of Allied troops at risk. It might have been one of the greatest blunders of the war. Just over 2 years earlier, an American carrier task force, sailing in the greatest secrecy, was butting through heavy seas 700 miles east of Japan. The carrier Hornet was about to launch one of the most daring air raids of the war. Massed on her flight deck were 16 Mitchell bombers of the US Army Air Force. Their target was Tokyo. The bombers took off from the Hornet in the early morning of the 18th of April, 1942. They were about to fly into history. But first they set course for the Japanese mainland. The bombing of Tokyo dealt a huge psychological blow to the Japanese. And the man who had masterminded and led the raid was the then Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. Short, pugnacious, and as brilliant a technician as he was a pilot, the 45-year-old Doolittle was as old as the age of aviation itself. He had played a leading role in opening up the skies of the world to the aeroplane. In the early years of the 20th century, the first flimsy fixed-wing aircraft had taken to the skies. The young Jimmy Doolittle was bitten by the aviation bug. The outbreak of war in Europe in August 1914 heralded a new era in aviation, although this was not immediately apparent. The tyranny of the trenches dominated the Western Front. But flying over the trenches were increasing numbers of military aircraft, the shape of things to come. Above the mud-bound battlefields of France, a new kind of war was fought, for air supremacy. In April 1917, the United States joined the war against Germany. But it would be many months before the Americans could make their presence felt on the battlefields of the Western Front. Jimmy Doolittle enlisted in the aviation section of the US Signal Corps, and in January 1918 commenced training as a pilot. Doolittle proved a natural aviator, but he never reached the Western Front. In November 1918, Germany surrendered. The war to end all wars was over. In the years that followed, stunt flying replaced dogfights over the trenches. Barnstorming provided work for many of the war's aviators. Simultaneously, the much-reduced American Air Corps was undergoing a revolution at the hands of its wartime commander, General Billy Mitchell, a tireless advocate of air power and, in particular, the role of the bomber. In a series of trials, Mitchell's aircraft pounded obsolete American and German warships. Mitchell believed that future wars would be won by aircraft alone. Meanwhile, pioneers like Charles Lindbergh were pushing back the boundaries of civil aviation. In May 1927, Lindbergh, piloting the Spirit of St. Louis, became the first man to make a non-stop solo flight across the Atlantic. Five years later, Amelia Earhart became the first woman to emulate Lindbergh's feat. She joined an elite international band of aviators whose record-breaking exploits were to produce profound technical and commercial results. Among their number was Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle stayed in the Army Air Corps after the war and became a record-breaking pilot. In 1922, Doolittle had been the first man to fly across America in less than 24 hours. 9 years later, and now a civilian, he had slashed the record to less than 12 hours, coast to coast in half a day. Doolittle was not just a superb natural airman who flew by the seat of his pants. He was also a formidable technician who had studied at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A daredevil with brains, Doolittle was the complete article. In 1925, he led a U.S. Army team to victory in the Schneider Trophy. Doolittle won the prestigious international seaplane race, flying a Curtiss biplane at an average speed of 233 miles per hour. One spectator said that the event was more of a procession than a race. A year later, on a South American trip, Doolittle piloted a Curtiss Hawk over the Andes. The flight was something of a first. Not only was Doolittle the first American to cross the mountain range, he was also the first and last man to manage it with the handicap of 2 broken ankles. Early in 1930, Doolittle had left the Army to join Shell as a test pilot, but he remained on the Army Reserve and continued to exploit his genius for calculated risks. He now had his eyes on a new world speed record. Doolittle was to fly the stubby and immensely powerful GB, a notoriously unstable aircraft which had already killed another racing pilot, Lowell Bales. Doolittle was undeterred. He worked out his own method of handling the GB and on the 3rd of September 1932 flew the homicidal flying barrel to a new world record of 294 miles per hour. Doolittle had made a smooth transition from military to civilian life while remaining at the cutting edge of aviation technology. He was as hard driving as ever, but retained a noticeably self-deprecatory air when he stepped in front of the ever-present newsreel cameras.
I'm sorry it took so long to get here. It didn't do the ship justice. I wandered off my course last night. Otherwise, it'd have been an hour and a half sooner. Just a little poor piloting.
Doolittle's new role as a roving ambassador for Shell took him to Europe, where, in Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had come to power in January 1933. Hitler and his henchmen had their own vision of air power. By 1935, German rearmament was being pursued openly. A new German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had been born. The director of the German Air Ministry's Technical Bureau was the dashing World War I fighter ace Ernst Udet. Udet befriended Doolittle on the latter's trips to Germany in the 30s. And it was Udet who was responsible for equipping the Luftwaffe with the Stuka dive bombers it needed to work as airborne artillery in the European campaigns of conquest, which were already taking shape in Hitler's mind. New bomber types like the Junkers Ju-88 were also given a dive-bombing capability. And a range of Luftwaffe aircraft, including the Heinkel HE-111, were combat tested by the German Condor Legion, which fought on the side of General Franco in the Spanish Civil War. HE-111s took part in the destruction of the Basque town of Guernica in April 1937, the shape of things to come. For the moment, Hitler had only to use the threat of war to get what he wanted. In September 1938, at Munich, he secured French and British agreement to his annexation of the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia. This only sharpened the Führer's appetite. In March 1939, he swallowed up the rest of Czechoslovakia. Returning to the United States from his last pre-war trip to Germany, Jimmy Doolittle delivered a gloomy report on the threat posed by the Luftwaffe to Major General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of the Air Corps. He then offered his services to Arnold in any capacity, whether military or civilian. Regretfully, Arnold told Doolittle that he would have to wait. But Adolf Hitler was not in a waiting mood. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. The Polish Air Force was destroyed within days. The German conquest of Poland took just 6 weeks. The summer of 1940 found the German High Command on the Channel coast of France, preparing for an invasion of southern England. But first, the Luftwaffe had to draw RAF Fighter Command into battle and destroy it. In the Battle of Britain, which lasted from July to October 1940, the previously all-conquering Luftwaffe was defeated by a narrow but decisive margin. The course of the battle was intently followed by military airmen on the other side of the Atlantic. But there was no respite for the British when it was won. The Battle of Britain was followed by nightly bombing raids on London and Britain's industrial cities. The Blitz was to last until May 1941. It claimed the lives of some 40,000 civilians and destroyed or damaged over 1 million homes. In the United States, involvement in the war in Europe seemed only a matter of time. But America was facing a breakneck expansion of its armed forces following the introduction of the draft in the autumn of 1940. In July of that year, Jimmy Doolittle was recalled to the Army Air Force. He was to play an important role in mobilizing the motor industry in Detroit for air production. It was not men the American Air Service lacked, but aircraft. In the summer of 1941, while America was still at peace, Doolittle came to Great Britain on a fact-finding tour. He visited air plants and airfields. Doolittle and his team studied RAF methods of operation, maintenance and repair. They were impressed by their opposite numbers' conviction that the war would be a long, hard haul. And Doolittle saw at first hand the RAF's new 4-engined heavy bomber force, the strategic weapon designed to carry the war back to Germany. War arrived for the United States not in Europe, but in the Pacific. On the 7th of December 1941, Japanese carrier-launched level and torpedo bombers, escorted by fighters, attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet's base at Pearl Harbor. In the following 6 months, the Japanese carved out a vast Pacific and Far Eastern empire. In February 1942, the British stronghold of Singapore, the linchpin of their defenses in the Far East, fell to the Japanese. But this humiliation was only the prelude to the Japanese invasion of neighboring Burma, which took their army to the borders of India. The American forces defending the Philippines were overwhelmed with equal suddenness and brutality. The last American troops held out until May 1942. The efficiency and ruthlessness of the Japanese armed forces had been grievously underestimated. Allied success stories, like the heroic feats of the Flying Tigers, American volunteers fighting for the Chinese Air Force, could not stem the Japanese tide of victory. But the Tigers demonstrated that the seemingly all-conquering Japanese could be taken on and given a bloody nose by a numerically inferior but well-trained, well-equipped and determined enemy. Amid the ruins of strategic defeat, President Roosevelt and his chiefs of staff were planning to strike back against mainland Japan. Air power seemed to provide the answer, but even the B-24 Liberator bomber, with a range of 2,200 miles, would not be able to hit Japan from bases in Alaska, 3,500 miles from the Japanese home islands. But Admiral Ernest J. King, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy, had a solution to this seemingly insoluble problem. He hit upon the idea of using aircraft carriers to place American bombers within range of Japan. An aircraft carrier could annihilate the vast distances of the Pacific. But like its sister four-engine bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress could not be flown from carriers because it required too long a takeoff. A smaller aircraft would have to be used. King settled on the Army Air Corps' twin-engined B-25 Mitchell. The man selected to command the Mitchell strike force was Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. In March 1942, he assembled 24 Mitchell bombers and their crews at Eglin Field, Florida. Here they practiced bombing and lifting their laden aircraft off a strip just 500 feet long. As yet, the crews had little idea of the nature of their mission. Doolittle, however, imbued them with the belief that they were being ready to strike a significant blow which would turn the tide of defeat in the Pacific. As many as 10,000 people were involved in preparing the Mitchells for their mission, from high-ranking air planners to mechanics and carrier crews, but the operation remained top secret. In its final form, the plan called for 16 B-25s to be embarked on the carrier Hornet. She was the latest of the American carriers, launched in December 1940. Hornet was to sail from San Francisco and rendezvous at sea with another carrier, Enterprise. Commanding the Enterprise task force was Admiral William Bull Halsey. He would take the combined task force to a point 550 miles from Japan. Here the bombers would fly off. The main target was the Japanese capital, Tokyo. But single B-25s would attack Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Thereafter they would fly on to China to land on airfields near the coast. The Mitchell bombers, stripped of most of their defensive armament to increase range, were too large to be stored below and had to be lashed to Hornet's flight deck. Hornet's task force steamed towards the rendezvous with Enterprise. It was only when Hornet was 24 hours out of San Francisco that Doolittle revealed the details of the mission to the bomber crews. The men tasked with attacking Tokyo were told that on no account were they to bomb the palace of the Emperor Hirohito. This would only stiffen Japanese morale. On the 13th of April, the two carrier groups met, and with Halsey in overall command, turned towards Tokyo. On board Hornet, the air crews filled the time by learning some basic Chinese, to use if they had to make forced landings or bail out over China. On the 16th of April, Doolittle and his crews were shaken to hear a Japanese radio broadcast joking about a false news agency report that American bombers had attacked Tokyo. Nevertheless, the next day there was a small ceremony aboard Hornet. 5 Japanese medals given to Americans before the war were attached to one of the bombs to be dropped on Tokyo. Afterwards, Doolittle gave the crews their final briefing. The attack was planned for the following day, the 18th of April. Doolittle would be the first to fly off, aiming to reach Tokyo at dusk. The fires started by his 2,000-pound incendiary bombs would guide his comrades in. The plan of attack would also bring the bombers over the Chinese coast at dawn. when they could more readily spot their landing fields. Now there was nothing left to do but watch the time tick away to H hour. But early on the morning of the 18th, Enterprise's radar located two Japanese vessels 12 miles away. Both of them quickly steamed out of range. At dawn, reconnaissance aircraft were launched by Halsey's task force. The carefully planned schedule had been disrupted, and the veil of secrecy which surrounded the mission torn aside. Shortly afterwards, two more vessels were spotted near the task force. One radioed base that it had spotted the carriers. Halsey ordered the interlopers to be sunk. But the task force commander realized that Surprise had now been lost. He ordered the immediate launch of the bombers. This meant the range to their targets was 150 miles greater than planned. The weather had also worsened. It would be extremely difficult to get Doolittle's bombers airborne. Hornet was pitching in a heavy sea. The moment of truth had arrived for the 16 Mitchell bombers. At about 7:15 a.m. local time, Doolittle maneuvered into position for takeoff. Giving his engines full throttle, he accelerated along the flight deck. As waves pushed the carrier's bows upwards, Doolittle's bombers struggled into the air. Reassured, the remaining 15 pilots began to take off in their leader's wake. Hornet's crew held their breath as, one by one, the bombers lumbered down the flight deck and clawed their way off. All 16 bombers managed to get safely airborne. Only the last of them caused real concern. A crewman slipped and lost his arm in the Mitchell's port propeller. Disconcerted, the pilot put his flaps in the wrong position, but still cleared the deck. Cheered on their way, they set course for Japan. Bull Halsey saluted the gallant airmen. By a remarkable coincidence, the city of Tokyo had staged an air raid practice while the American bombers were taking off. Its citizens were not inclined to take it seriously. The practice ended at midday, and the busy city returned to its Saturday bustle, little changed from peacetime. Nevertheless, Japanese warships began to search for the two American carriers. Unaware of these developments, Doolittle and his bombers made landfall on the Japanese coast at about midday. As they flew over the fields, farm workers gazed up at them, seemingly unconcerned. One Japanese who was surprised to see them was the Prime Minister, General Hideki Tojo. He was airborne at the time, en route to an airbase, and actually passed one of Doolittle's B-25s. Bombs began to fall on Tokyo at 12:30 p.m. Until they exploded on their targets, most Japanese remained under the illusion that the bombers were a feature of the air raid drill. But now the price for the premature launch had to be paid. The bombers were running low on fuel. Having released their bombs, they had now to take the shortest route to China, which meant crash landing in Japanese-occupied territory. To avoid this, one aircraft flew to the Russian port of Vladivostok, where the crew were interned. 8 crewmen who landed in China were captured and later executed. 3 were killed when their B-25 crashed. But Doolittle and 68 of his men reached territory held by the Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek and made their way back to the United States. When the story of the raid broke, it provided the first good news of the war for America. President Roosevelt held a press conference, but refused to say how the bombers had reached Japan. The president told the newsmen that Doolittle's force had flown from Shangri-La, the mythical kingdom made famous by James Hilton's novel and the film by director Frank Capra. Doolittle and his men received a hero's welcome. For his courage and leadership, Jimmy Doolittle was awarded America's highest decoration for bravery, the Congressional Medal of Honor. And there were medals for his air crews. Their achievement had been unique in the annals of air warfare. Meanwhile, in Europe, massive forces were on the move. The German army had opened its summer offensive in Russia. Under mounting pressure, the Russians appealed to the British and Americans for the speedy opening of a second front in northwest Europe. In North Africa, Rommel's Africa Corps was also pressing the British hard, threatening a breakthrough which would secure Germany the oil riches of the Middle East. Simultaneously, an Allied invasion force under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower was preparing to land in French North Africa to trap Rommel between the invasion force and General Montgomery's British Eighth Army, which had begun to push back Rommel after victory at El Alamein. It was Eisenhower's first major command. The air commander for the Allied invasion, codenamed Torch, was Jimmy Doolittle. At first, Doolittle had his hands tied. Until airfields could be established in North Africa, air support for Torch would be flown from Gibraltar and from aircraft carriers. Moreover, Doolittle soon discovered that he did not see eye to eye with Eisenhower. On the 6th of November 1942, Doolittle flew out to the Allied Command Center at Gibraltar. Off Cape Finisterre, his lone B-17 was attacked by a flight of German Junkers Ju-88 maritime patrol aircraft. The co-pilot was wounded, and Doolittle had to take his place. The B-17 was trailing smoke when the Ju-88s, running low on fuel, broke off the engagement. It had been a close call, but at least it had familiarized Doolittle with the controls of the B-17, an aircraft he had never flown before. The Flying Fortress touched down safely in Gibraltar. The Torch landings, the first Anglo-American operation of the war, went in on the 8th of November. There was some resistance from the Vichy French army, but within 3 days the fighting was over. 12th Air Force established its first base near Oran in Algeria. It was not long before Doolittle was taking out a new RAF Spitfire Mark 9 for a spin. His airman's curiosity had been aroused by the British fighter, but his flight aroused the anger of Eisenhower. He carpeted Doolittle and told him that he could choose between promotion to Major General or flying around looking for Germans. Doolittle chose to be a Major General. The Torch landings did not lead to a swift Allied victory in northwest Africa. The British and Americans had 5 months of hard fighting ahead of them as the Africa Corps withdrew behind powerful defensive positions in Tunisia. 12th Air Force had been redesignated Northwest African Strategic Air Force, but it expended much of its energy in a tactical battlefield role. And Eisenhower's strictures did not prevent Doolittle from continuing to fly missions, in spite of the personal risk. But Doolittle was one of the senior commanders who knew about the greatest secret of the war, the breaking of the German Enigma codes by the Allies. By continuing to fly operations, he was placing in jeopardy one of the war-winning weapons in the Allied armory. His friend and colleague, General George S. Patton, shared Doolittle's relish for action. Patton, Doolittle, and Montgomery all made use of Ultra, but the two Americans alarmed the Allied High Command by continuing to expose themselves to risk of capture. Doolittle's attitude towards ultra-security was to lead to near disaster. The grounds of Bletchley Park, a Victorian country house north of London, were the home of the code-breaking teams which played a vital part in Allied victory. These huts were the battleground for a secret war in which the code-breakers unravelled the mystery of the German Enigma machine. Theirs was one of the great technical triumphs of the war. The Enigma machine resembled a typewriter, but one with a difference. The striking of a key would light up a substitute letter on a panel above the keyboard. A complex system of rotors and wiring ensured that the substitution could be made in any one of 150 million ways. The encoded Enigma message was transmitted in Morse and decrypted at the receiving end by a second Enigma machine with the same settings as the first. The Germans believed that Enigma was unbreakable, but the British had broken the code and were reading intercepted messages on a regular basis. In Tunisia, this enabled the Allies to thwart German attempts to resupply the Africa Corps. Enigma decrypts provided detailed information on every German aerial convoy to North Africa. Lumbering German transports like the Messerschmitt Gigant powered glider were doomed even before they took off. But the Allies were careful to let some of these supply missions through, the better to preserve the Ultra secret. Ultra had played an important part in the Tunisian campaign, which ended with the German surrender on the 13th of May 1943. As one of the small circle of Ultra initiates, Doolittle had been discouraged from flying missions lest he fall into the hands of the enemy and, in some manner, reveal the secret work of Bletchley Park. Doolittle resisted all pressure and flew throughout the Tunisian campaign. At its end, he was full of praise for his men.
The jobs of the Northwest African Strategic Air Force were first to stop supplies of materiel and personnel getting into Tunisia, and later to stop personnel from getting out. These jobs were accomplished by destroying both the supplies and the means of bringing supplies in. Harbors were attacked, marshalling yards, shipping, both naval and merchant, and the enemy air, both his offensive air force and his air transport. I want to take this occasion to congratulate and to thank the boys of the Northwest African Strategic Air Force for the job they have done. It's been outstanding.
With North Africa cleared of Axis forces, the next Allied objective was the invasion of Sicily, the stepping stone to the Italian mainland. A gigantic amphibious force was assembled for Operation Husky, 2,500 ships and landing craft to carry 180,000 men of Patton's 7th Army and Montgomery's 8th. As a preliminary to Husky, Allied aircraft mounted a month-long bombardment of the island of Pantelleria, lying 60 miles south of Sicily and garrisoned by German and Italian troops. The sky over Pantelleria became so congested that the Allied aircraft had to circle the target, waiting their turn to bomb. The island was occupied by Allied troops on the 11th of June. A month later, the Allies landed in Sicily. The liberation of Europe had begun. While the battle for Sicily raged, Doolittle's bombers flew missions against the Italian mainland. On the 19th of July, he joined the B-17s of 97th Bomb Group on a raid against marshalling yards on the outskirts of Rome. The success of the raid not only disrupted the Axis supply lines, but also hastened the fall of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Allied air power was now reaching out to strike at the heart of the enemy's war-making capacity. On the 1st of August 1943, a force of 177 B-24 bombers of the US 9th Air Force struck a blow against the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, the vital center for the supply of fuel for the German Army and Air Force. 50 bombers were lost in the running battle they fought all the way to the target. The strategic bombing campaign was threatening to get its hands around the jugular of Germany's fuel supply. In Northern Europe, the US 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command were committed to a combined bombing offensive aimed at clearing the way for the Allied invasion of France. Its stated purpose was the progressive destruction and dislocation of the German military, industrial and economic system, and the undermining of the morale of the German people to a point where their capacity for armed resistance is fatally weakened. But the transformation of policy into operational reality threatened to turn into a nightmare for the Americans. Flying by day over cloud-covered German targets, the American bomber formation sustained mounting losses. The 8th Air Force's fighters lacked the range to escort the bombers to and from their targets. German fighters took an increasingly heavy toll of aircraft and, more important, air crew.
No chance there.
By the late summer of 1943, average losses per mission in 8th Air Force were running at an unacceptable 10%. Morale had fallen to a dangerously low point. Only 35 of every 100 American aircrew could expect to complete their tour of 25 missions in Europe. 8th Air Force's popular commander, General Ira C. Aker, was facing a growing crisis. It was not until December 1943 that the situation was transformed by the introduction of the P-51 Mustang fighter, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin and fitted with drop tanks which were to give it a range of 1,500 miles. The Mustang could escort the bombers all the way to their targets in Germany and back. The beneficiary of the Mustang was Jimmy Doolittle, who replaced Aker as the commander of 8th Air Force in January 1944. His arrival at 8th Air Force coincided with that of a war-winning escort fighter. Doolittle was not content to tie the Mustangs to his bomber wings. He ordered the formation of fighting patrols to seek out and destroy enemy fighters wherever they were. The balance in the air war over Germany swung back in favor of the Americans. Now it was the Luftwaffe which was losing its elite pilots to the marauding Mustangs. As Doolittle told his fighter commander, General William E. Kepner, "Your mission is to destroy the German Air Force." Kepner was happy to oblige. Doolittle's bomber leaders were not happy with the tactic, nor with their commander's decision to increase the number of missions in a tour to 30. Some labeled their commander a killer, but most of the killing was inflicted on the Luftwaffe. Doolittle had grasped the simple truth that before you can destroy the enemy's war industry, you first have to destroy his air defenses. This the Mustangs did. For their pilots, the new tactics were exhilarating.
They went down and looked for trains or barges on the river or any enemy installations such as airfields. And wherever we could find a suitable target, we would turn loose. That was playtime.
It was a great thrill to hit an airfield and blow the planes up, or to hit a transportation target, to hit a locomotive and see the steam blow.
We'd go down on the deck, and if it moved, well, you kill it.
In June 1944, an old friend of Doolittle, Brigadier General Arthur W. Vanneman, joined 8th Air Force as Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence. In the 1930s, Vanneman, an air engineer, had become an expert on the developing German Air Force and had served in Berlin as Assistant Air Attaché. Somewhat belatedly, 8th Air Force had recognized that Vanneman's expertise might be useful. He flew into England on the eve of the Normandy invasion, the 5th of June 1944. Vanneman's arrival coincided with a major effort mounted by 8th Air Force against the launching sites of the German V-1 flying bombs on the French coast. Vanneman played an important role in target selection and briefing. Vanneman himself had been briefed by Doolittle on the ultra-secret. He had joined the select band of officers who knew of the existence and importance of Bletchley Park. But Vanneman was not content merely to fly a desk. He asked Doolittle if he could go through the same experience as the men he briefed. Vanneman had already flown operational missions, but he felt a need to go again. He told Doolittle that he would do his job better if he had a chance to go overhead. Despite specific instructions that officers who knew the ultra-secret should not be exposed to unnecessary risk, Doolittle gave Vanneman the go-ahead to fly. Doolittle, the master of the calculated risk, should have grounded his intelligence officer, but he had flown missions himself after being admitted to the ultra-secret. Vanneman's B-17, which bore the curious name Nightjar Nunnan, flew onto its rendezvous with a burst of heavy flak. Vanneman parachuted to safety, of a kind. He was now on the run in occupied Europe. He had also caught some shrapnel in his legs. Vanneman was picked up by German troops within 24 hours and joined other wounded American airmen in a military hospital. Vanneman was now an extremely worried man. He knew that he talked in his sleep and remained in constant dread of revealing the ultra-secret when he dozed off. After a spell under guard in Berlin, Vanneman was moved, at his own insistence, to a large prisoner-of-war camp, Stalag Luft III. To the end of the war, and through many adventures, Vanneman clung on to the ultra-secret. In London, there was consternation at the news that Vanneman was now a prisoner of the Germans. His ill-fated mission over France was discussed at the very highest level. Doolittle stepped forward to shoulder the responsibility. But the British were obliged to temper their outrage. Exactly a month before D-Day, an RAF Lancaster bomber had been shot down over France. Flying in the bomber was a planning officer, Air Commodore Ronald Ivelaw Chapman, who knew all about Ultra. He too found himself at large in France. Group Captain Frederick Winterbottom was the intelligence officer responsible for safeguarding the ultra-secret. He had the unpleasant task of telling Prime Minister Winston Churchill that Ivelaw Chapman was alive and on the run in France. There was an almighty row. Churchill was furious. Winterbottom arranged for an RAF Westland Lysander to fly to France to retrieve the stranded Ivelaw Chapman, who was now being harboured by the French resistance. But before the rescue mission could be launched, Ivelaw Chapman was captured. Like Vanneman, he sat out the war as a guest of the Germans. And like Vanneman, he kept the ultra-secret. To the end of the war, the German High Command remained confident that the unbreakable Enigma code had not been penetrated by the British. When they were told after the war that even Adolf Hitler's orders were being read by the code breakers in real time, the German generals were dumbfounded. Doolittle and Vanneman had put Ultra at risk, but it remained a secret until the end of the conflict. The capitulation of the German army to the British and Americans in the spring of 1945 was swift and total. But it was the very speed and totality of the collapse which denied the advocates of strategic bombing the proof that theirs had been the decisive contribution to Allied victory. "75% of 8th Air Force's bombs had fallen on Germany after D-Day, the point at which Germany's defeat in the West had become inevitable. As the German war economy disintegrated under the remorseless pressure exerted by the combined bombing offensive, it became all but impossible to isolate which factors were decisive. But the bomber offensive in which Jimmy Doolittle played a key role had cast a long and deadly shadow over Adolf Hitler's Germany. The German surrender in Europe in May 1945 did not spell the end of the war for Doolittle and 8th Air Force. There was still a war to be finished against Japan. Doolittle and his command found themselves bound for the Pacific and the strategic bombing campaign waged by the mighty B-29s of 21st Bomber Command. Doolittle had come a long way since his 16 twin-engined Mitchells had struggled into the air from Hornet in April 1942. In the Pacific, a strategic bombing campaign of crushing scale had been waged by 21st Bomber Command under the hard-driving leadership of the cigar-chomping General Curtis B. LeMay. LeMay had pulled his bombers down to the deck, loaded them with incendiaries, and launched them at night to lay waste to the densely packed and highly combustible cities of Japan. By the time 8th Air Force was ready to join the fray, LeMay was running out of targets to attack. The B-29s were now flying virtually unmolested over the shattered cities of Japan. Their escorts had swept the last vestiges of fighter opposition from the skies. The bombers alone seemed to have victory within their grasp. But it was to take just 2 atomic bombs, dropped in August 1945 on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to force the Japanese to the surrender table. The ruins of these flattened cities were grim reminders that a new world of air power had dawned. And flying into Tokyo for the surrender ceremony was one man who had played a vital part in this unfolding story from its very beginning. The man whose bombers had been the first to strike a blow against the heart of the Japanese Empire, Jimmy Doolittle. He was always the airman's airman.